Hello, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about Blue Marbles candle holder, stained glass style. Now in this candle holder I used actual full round marbles, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So first of all, I used 22 gauge bare copper wire, and I made these loops to support my marbles and my other glass globs. I'm using a baling pliers that have a variety of sizes to choose from, and this particular size is perfect for my round marbles and my flat glass globs that I will be showing you. So you can use whatever round tools you have to make your wire loops. I'm also using my favorite black backed copper foil, and I'm cutting it in different lengths. This is 7/32 inch width, and I'm using, for this particular thing, I have a macrame metal hoops, and actually I'm showing you a smaller hoop, but it's the same technique that I use for all my wire. You need to cover your wire macrame loops that you purchase with some kind of copper foil in order for the solder to stick to them. This is one way that I cover my round hoops. So you can go the long way like I'm illustrating right now, or you can go around, and around. Whichever way you do it, there's pros and cons with it. With this particular way, it takes a little longer to do the round and round kind of way, but you end up with a little bit less of a chance of it peeling back while you're soldering. But either way looks fine, going the long way or going around, okay? So as you can see, both look nice. This is the round around, and as opposed to the other one. The other one's a little bit smoother, but it does, you do end up with seams sometimes. With the smaller flat globs that I am using, I use 1/4 of the width of the copper foil. Now for the marbles that I use for this project, I used 1/2 of the width. So it really depends on how big your glass is. Whichever item you use, you do need to squish down the foil and make it all smooth and sticking to your glass as much as possible. Now, especially when you're doing something really small like these globs, you really want to have it squished down nicely because you're not going to have a lot of surface to solder to anyway. So these are my marbles, and as you can see, I use a little bit more foil on the marbles than I did on the small, round, flat pieces of glass. But whatever ones you use, you want to make sure that it fits your wire loops. I actually use brass wire for these, but you can use brass or copper. Both accept solder really quickly, and you don't need to pre-tin them. But you want to be able to solder them on, and I am now attaching my round marbles to a wire hoop or a macrame hoop, which you can buy them on Amazon. I will have a link in my description page to where I bought them, and of course it's covered with foil. Now I'm soldering it nicely as I'm going around, and now no matter what you use, you want to solder very liberally, not liberally, minimally as you're going around. You don't want to add a lot of solder to any of this glass quickly. You just want to do like one area of the glass at a time, because the heat from the solder will make the stickiness of the foil release from either the macrame hoop or the marble itself. So you want to just add a little bit as you're going and then go to the next one. If you heat it up too much, your glass will pop out. If you heat up the macrame hoop too much, it will leave a seam. Now what I'm using for the bottom of this candle holder is a can of, it was a drink mix, and I cut the bottom off of it and then covered it with foil and put solder on it. And I'm using that for the bottom because it's a nice flat bottom. Now for the swirly design, I coiled a bunch of wire. I'm using a piece of plastic that's nice and sturdy to make a nice kind of a measurement to make sure that my round macrame hoops are parallel to the last one. So you can use a measuring device, anything you have, but you want to make sure that they're symmetrically lined if you want this look. I mean, I guess you could have them at different angles if you want to, but for this particular project, I wanted them all to be concentric to the bottom. Now I have all these tinned pieces of, I think I used 22 gauge tinned wire for this, so you can use anything you want to. But the nice thing about 22 gauge is that it's easy to bend, but it's not so wimpy that you don't see it when you're done. So it's a nice wire to use for something like this. And I use tinned so that when I'm done, I'm going to use copper or black patina, and it will pretty much take the patina. Now I have noticed that black patina will adhere to the tinned copper a lot better than the copper patina. So it's really up to you. But the thing about using tinned wire is you don't have to like cover the whole piece of wire with solder, and it's a nice clean look. So it's whatever you want. But anyways, I coiled a whole bunch of these, and I did this so that I'd have a nice variety of coily designs to choose from for when I actually want to solder them on. So I can pick and choose which one I want to use. And then I'm just holding them in place temporarily with a pair of tweezers and then soldering them. And I'm putting like little globs of solder in the middle of each coil, just as a little design, like it's going to be like a little blob of solder there. So I thought that was really pretty. You can also, because I'm building this over a paper towel with the blue piece is silicone, a sheet of silicone, I can use pins if I need to into the paper towel to hold these in place if I decide I need that extra support, that the pliers aren't holding it properly. So as you can see, because these are coils, you can use your pliers and move the coil into a little bit different configuration as you need to. So basically, if you solder one spot, then you can bend the coil to be exactly what you want. So now I'm adding like little globs of solder into the middle of each coil, and that's just as like a little extra little bling for interest. It's really whatever you want. So I just thought it looked kind of nice to have that extra like little design there. The bigger circles didn't really want to take the solder globs, so I only put them in the smaller ones. That one was kind of being a pain. Now I took my paper towel silicone sheet out, and that's where I have my my first layer for my candle. And I decided that at this point I'm going to tin everything that's still copper colored before I do the next layer. Now you don't have to do this. You can wait until you're completely done with this with the candle holder, and then tin whatever you want to when you're done. So it's really up to you. And if you're going to end up using copper colored patina on it, you may decide that you don't need to tin everything with solder, because the copper patina is pretty much the same color as the copper foil, so they'll kind of blend nicely together. So it's really up to you, of course. Putting solder on top of the copper hoops will kind of smooth out any seams that you're wrapping around with copper will created, and it will kind of like negate those seams, so it looks more similar in texture to the rest of your project. As you can see, I'm using any scraps of solder that dropped off my project. I'm kind of scooping up with my solder iron as I go. So I have another hoop that I foiled, and I'm attaching it to my project. Now I don't really have to measure this next row because I'm using these glass hearts that I bought, and those are consistent, and I will use those as the measurement between the two. That'll kind of keep it all symmetrical. So I'm soldering a piece to the bottom and to the top. I used about a quarter to a third width of the 7/32 copper foil to foil these hearts. Because the hearts are quite large and the foiling is not that wide. Now, if you use a wider piece of foil, you're going to encroach upon the shape of your glass glob or heart, and it's no longer going to be as perfect a shape when you're done, because your foiling is probably not going to be perfect. So in order to keep the perfect heart shape, I only used a very thin piece of foil, but it ended up, as you can imagine, not being very strong. So I did end up putting wire around each heart and around the circles I added later on to help make it sturdy enough to withstand some use, because of course foil is not the strongest product in the world. Once you have put solder on the foil, it does make the foil, the foil is basically as an armature to hold the solder. But if your foil does not actually wrap around very much, it's not going to be that sturdy once you cover it with solder. Now, obviously, this is not the color glass I ended up using, but I had a nice video of these globs, so I'm using that as a demonstration. So these are flat globs, and they have been foiled, of course, and I used a quarter of the width for these, because these glass globs are only about 15 millimeters in diameter, so they're not terribly big, but they're not those teeny ones that I showed you earlier. But these still need to be soldered into some kind of wire frame, so I used the same technique to make little loops of wire to hold my globs in place. And you don't have to do this. You could just solder on foiled glass to your project, but then they probably would just fall right off after you use them. So this will help give me a a nice sturdy support to hold the glass. And I'm using this, I'm soldering just the bottom of these globs onto the next hoop that I just attached. So I'm just attaching the bottom of the loops. Not even going to attach all of them at this point. I want to see, is it going to be symmetrical? Because once I get to the end of this round bunch of glass, I just kind of hope that they're going to actually meet at the end, because I'm not really sure that I'm going to end up with an even number of circles, and I'm going to hope that I can make it work. So I cut off one and to see if that's going to meet nicely, and it ended up that it's not really the right number, so I ended up cutting off another one and then soldering the end to the first one that I did, and then kind of splitting the difference and making it line up nicely. I was lucky in that it was pretty accurate, and since I didn't solder all of them on, I could just kind of blend it out so that it worked. It's sort of like when you're sewing and you're trying to do an elastic or gathered area like in a skirt or something, and then you kind of like spread out the gather. I am spreading out the loops so that they end up being, they look like they were purposely that size. And now I'm adding glass to the last few that I need to put glass in, because I didn't do enough of them. So I make a whole long wire loops and I fill them up with glass before I attach them to my hoop. And then if I didn't do enough, then I'll just add glass to the last few. If I did too many, well, then I just cut those off. It's not the biggest deal. But you don't want to bend your string of wire to the round shape of the hoop until you have attached your glass to it, because it's a lot easier to attach the glass when they're flat. I mean, yeah, you can do this. You could have like not had any attached. What I'm using is another piece of silicone between my finger and the wire at times, because it's too hot to just hold. Even though I'm wearing a silicone glove to help dissipate the heat, it still can be hot. I'm using 26 gauge bare copper wire to make like an outline, a support for the glass, the larger glass globs that I didn't make armatures for. Like I could have done hearts and made a bunch of hearts and then put the glass hearts into wire shaped hearts, but I didn't do that. So I am adding the wire afterwards. So you saw that I outlined that side of the heart with a piece of wire, and now I'm doing it to another one. So the nice thing about the 26 gauge is that it's thin enough to bend to what you want on the fly like this without being too hard on your existing project. You can just wrap the 26 gauge around and solder as you go. Now, of course, you could use something thinner. You could use 28 gauge. But the thing is that the thinner you go, of course, the less support you'll have. So I've found that the 26 gauge is just an ideal gauge for what I'm doing. So whenever I'm trying to just wrap have a piece of wire and I'm just wrapping it around a project, 26 gauge is just an ideal size. You can even use it on these littler pieces of glass globs that I'm attaching. So I'm like tacking them in place and then wrapping them with some wire, and that will help hold them all together. And because some of the globs are really small, I might not think that all of them need to be supported with wire. It really depends on the size and how vulnerable I think the glass will be when I'm finished. So I had a bunch of these clear glass globs, and I'm putting them where they will fit and then supporting them as I can. I have larger pieces of glass globs and I have smaller ones. So that's a larger one, and I'm just kind of putting them here and there. You might have noticed when I put the hearts in, I didn't like measure where I was putting them, so I put them exactly a third of the diameter of the project. I just kind of like guessed, and that's because I knew I wasn't going to put glass between the hearts that was symmetrical. I wanted the glass between the hearts to be kind of haphazard and different in different areas, so I didn't have to worry about the hearts being placed exactly a third of the way, because I wasn't going to put like a perfect pattern between them. Because the 26 gauge is really very bendable, if I end up having like a little kink in the wire, I can just add a little solder there and it's not going to really deter from the finished look. And if it didn't end up being perfectly smooth with the object that I'm soldering it to, that's okay, because it just kind of goes with the somewhat clumpy soldering that I'm doing for the whole project. So now I am adding solder to any copper that's left, and I'm kind of going here and there. I'm not doing everything perfectly as I'm going, because again, if I get overly indulgent in one particular piece of glass, it will heat up too much and pop out. So I pretty much have to keep rotating my project and adding solder as I go, and then eventually having the whole thing covered in solder. It's really tempting when you see an area that needs solder to just like do the whole area and finish it. Don't do that. Go from one spot to another, and just know that you will come back and you will finish it, and now it's completely covered in solder and it's ready to do the patina. Now for the patina for this project, I actually put the patina in a Ziploc bag and just kind of swished it around and around and around, and that really worked nicely without wasting patina. It ended up being very black and looked great. And I used a bright candle, and even the bright battery operated candles worked very nice for this look. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.